Hello. Well, welcome everyone. I'm very pleased to be hosting today's event on climate change, the environment, and peace building. This is the seventh installment of the Center for Security Governance's eSeminar series. My name again is Mark Sedra, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Security Governance. This is actually the fourth eSeminar of a special series that we've been running on the topic of contemporary debates on peace building and state building. We have received generous financial support for this series from Canada's International Development Research Centre. So let me take this opportunity to thank the IDRC for their support. We also have two superb institutional partners for this series, the Balsillie School of International Affairs, of which I'm also affiliated, and Wilfrid Laurier University, both based in Waterloo, Canada. Now, if you're not aware of the tremendous research and academic programs based at these two institutions, I encourage you to visit their websites or contact them directly. Now, I'd like to say a few words about my own organization before we launch into the event. This is the Center for Security Governance. The Center for Security Governance, or CSG as we call it, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank dedicated to the study of security and governance transitions in fragile, failed, and conflict-affected states. We're very interested in exploring new innovations in peace building and state building practice. We are a registered charity based in Kitchener, Canada. We're only roughly 3 years old, so we're still a very young institution. Now that I have that out of the way, let me say a few words about why we have selected the topic for today's event. We are all well aware of the catastrophic threats that climate change poses to our environment. At least most of us, I should say, are aware. Now, less attention, however, is often paid to the secondary effects, such as its impact on global peace and conflict dynamics. Climate change is already emerging as a major driver of conflict and insecurity in many parts of the world. And this phenomenon will likely worsen in the future as the environmental impacts of the changing climate become more pronounced. This presents new challenges to the global peace-building architecture that have yet to be fully addressed by its key stakeholders. As we enter an era that could be marked by climate-driven conflict, it is important to explore the potential impacts of climate change on global peace and security, and how the existing peace-building agenda can be adapted to confront or at least consider them. To address this topic, we've assembled what I think is a first-rate panel. We are very fortunate to have secured such a distinguished group, in my opinion. And I'll introduce them now before passing the floor to each of them so that they can make 10 to 12 minutes of remarks. At the end of their talks, don't go away, because there's going to be a question period where all of you, all of the participants, will be able to pose questions to our speakers via the chat box or the chat function on this platform. Please feel free to chat and post comments and questions about the event as it's running. That's absolutely encouraged. Your questions and comments that you place in the chat box as the presentations are going on will be collected and presented to the speakers during the discussion period. So let me just now briefly introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is Anna Brack. Anna joined the Geneva Center for Security Policy in 2006. She's a senior program officer in the Emerging Security Challenges program there. In this capacity, she's involved in developing and leading a number of training, outreach, and research activities, mainly in the area of human and environmental security. Her research interests include international human security, environmental security, climate change, the global public commons, and resource management. Well, welcome, Anna. Our second panelist is Dr. Richard Matthew. Dr. Matthew is a professor of international environmental politics in the schools of social ecology and social science at the University of California at Irvine, and founding director of the Center for Unconventional Security Affairs. He studies and is interested in a number of topics, including the environmental dimensions of conflict and peace building, climate change adaptation in conflict and post-conflict societies, and transnational threat systems. He's done extensive field work in conflict zones in South Asia and East, Central, and West Africa. Among his many affiliations, and I won't list them all here, he's a senior member of the United Nations Expert Advisory Group on Environment, Conflict, and Peace Building. So welcome, Richard. Finally, our third panelist is a colleague of mine at the Balsillie School of International Affairs, Dr. Simon Dalby. He is a CG chair in the political economy of climate change and professor of geography and environmental studies at Wilfrid Laurier University. His published research deals with climate change, political ecology, geopolitics, global security, environmental change, militarization, and the spatial dimensions of governance. Among his many publications, he is the author of the 2009 book titled Security and Environmental Change. So with that, let me pass the floor to our first speaker, Anna Brack. So Anna, take it away.
Hi, hello everybody from Geneva, almost a weekend here. I'm very happy to address this panel and you out there, everywhere in the world. What I will do now is to give you an introductory presentation of around 10 minutes, and I will focus on main climate security challenges. I will give you some examples of climate change implications for conflict and main takeaways going forward. The map of the Earth is being redrawn by climate change, and it is not only in geographical terms, but also in terms of security. I would like to start my short presentation by asking you to imagine the world with below 2, 4, and 6 degrees and above warming. Knowing the current security situation in the world, imagine your city, your region, and the whole world with these 3 different temperature lenses. The below 2 degrees raise maintains the global security status quo. The 4 degrees increase aggravates it, and the 6 degrees and more will make it almost impossible to manage the implications. Climate change is an existential threat, literally, as it will affect living conditions of all of us. It influences security on all levels, and it's both state and human security. Climate change is not a security threat as such. It is a threat multiplier, and you all know it already, which means that any given security threat will become more important with increased warming. And virtually all the current security threats could be exacerbated by climate change, and consider these 6 following examples. Firstly, if temperatures rise more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, we will see island countries disappearing and considerable implications for densely populated coastal areas. Knowing that out of 198 countries in the world, only 44 are landlocked, we can only imagine the scale of this challenge. Apart from the obvious danger for the physical safety of populations, one of the consequences will impact maritime boundaries and security. Secondly, natural disasters and extreme weather conditions have been on a significant rise. Even though one cannot attribute all of them to climate change, majority is linked to it. They include heat waves, hurricanes, floods, fires, landslides, and droughts. There is again an obvious threat to physical life of affected populations, but the damages will be higher in fragile and conflict-affected regions, and I think that the other panelists will address it in more detail. Thirdly, water security. For past several years, the risk report of the World Economic Forum has been putting water crisis at the top of their security agenda. Climate change will decrease the availability of fresh water and put pressure on water management within countries, but also in transboundary basins. This competition over water, if not efficiently governed, might lead to social unrest and even intra or interstate conflicts. 4, food security, which is very closely linked to water security, climate change has the potential of decreasing yields and disrupt the food production. This, combined with population growth and changing energy demands, will probably increase food prices. This could lead not only to human security challenges, but also to riots and eventually to conflicts. The fifth challenge on my list is health security, which will be affected through impact on water quality, air pollution, and change in land use. We may expect an increase in infectious disease and undernutrition, also mental health. This impact will vary by age and gender and be really mostly seen and felt by the vulnerable societies. And finally, migration. All the above security threats have the potential to increase migration significantly. Currently, data is unclear on how many people will move and where due to climate change. Yet we know that climate change is currently a cause of migration in island states and certain coastal areas. This is expected to increase with rising temperatures. The fact is that for the moment, most climate change-induced migration is short-term and local. However, refugee crises are becoming an increasingly concern for state security, as we can see in Europe right now. Human security is also affected by the nexus between migration and climate change. And uncontrolled climate change migration has the potential to become one of the major security challenges for policymakers. The above 6 security challenges are global, multidimensional, and interconnected. I am sure that other panelists will talk more about peace building. I just wanted to underline that with the above security threats, peace building may become even more complex as climate change increases the strain on the number of challenges, their prioritization, and allocation of resources that peace building actors will have to deal with. And finally, the question of conflict and climate change. Climate change has not yet been identified as an official cause for the conflict. However, when we look at this link with the 3 different temperature lenses of below 2, 4, and 6 degrees Celsius, and the situation may really change. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in its assessment in 2014, concluded that, and here I quote, climate change can indirectly increase risks of violent conflicts in the form of civil war and intergroup violence by amplifying well-documented drivers of these conflicts such as poverty and economic shocks. Almost all the conflicts have an environmental component to them to larger or less extent. However, would today's hotspots such as Iraq, Afghanistan, Ukraine, Burundi, and Central African Republic qualify? The widely quoted study on Syria and the link between drought, population movement, and conflict is an interesting attempt to link climate change to conflict. But climate change was not the cause of the conflict in Syria, and we all know this. Let's face it, it is lack of good governance and poor leadership that may exacerbate environmental tensions to lead to war. Climate change doesn't, at least for the time being, cause conflict alone. This will be a different story if we come to live in the world of 4 or 6 degrees and above warming. Climate change action is a global scale prevention operation, and the security aspects of climate change are not taken into consideration as much as they need to be. Take the outcome of the Munich Security Conference last week, where the main focus was on Syria, obviously Ukraine, the refugee crisis, and the rise of ISIS. But just imagine all these challenges with an add-on of a warmer and even less stable world. I just wanted to tell you a small story of the GCSP, the Geneva Center for Security Policy, because what we do here is educate policymakers, representatives of international organizations, civil society, media, and private sector in a range of security issues, including climate change and security nexus. We are facing 2 challenges. Firstly, given the existing knowledge gaps, especially in the link between climate change and conflict and climate change and migration, evidence-based policies are difficult to develop. Secondly, the prevailing silos culture prevents us from a harmonized climate action. Interestingly, silos do not only concern public and private cooperation, but also communication within governments, when, for example, people from the Ministry of Environment are not included in foreign or defense policy of a particular country. In our executive education and dialogue activities, the GCSP tries to promote this multi-stakeholder approach to dealing with security challenges, including climate change. I would like to leave you with 3 takeaways after this very short presentation. Firstly, climate change is a threat multiplier and affects almost all of the non-security challenges, both traditional and non-traditional. Secondly, the link between climate change and conflict may not be proven, but with global warming going beyond 2 degrees Celsius, the risk of having more climate-related social unrest and conflict increases. And finally, and it's especially applicable to my context where I deal with training of policymakers all around the world, there is a need of evidence-based climate policies. However, there is still a knowledge gap in areas such as conflict and climate change, migration and climate change. And in going forward, this needs to become a priority to be able to produce better policies. I will stop now. I would like to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to questions.
Well, thank you very much, Anna. I think you got us off to a great start in drawing that connection between climate change and conflict, talking about it as a force multiplier. I like that notion, and I think that leads us very well into the next presentation. So I'll pass the floor now to Richard. Richard, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And what I want to do is talk a little bit about the relationship between climate change and peace building. And I'll try and build on some of the comments of the last that made by Anna. And when I talk about peace building, I'm talking about peace building in the sense that the United Nations uses it as sort of building the capacities that a country might need in order to manage the various factors that could otherwise, in the absence of this, push it towards conflict or towards a relapse into conflict. And clearly, if climate change is one of those factors, then it makes sense that peace building try to build the capacity to manage climate change. I think, as Anna pointed out, climate change is closely linked to violent conflict and so on, in a variety of indirect ways. And so we think of climate change in terms of water stress, in terms of changes in energy use, and changes of patterns of infectious disease, agricultural outputs, and so on. Since a lot of these have been already mentioned, let me just redirect my own comments towards another area: natural disasters. I think that generally speaking, there's a sense that climate change is almost certainly on a trajectory to increase the intensity and the frequency of natural disasters, especially hydrological and meteorological disasters, over the next few decades. In fact, Stefan Hallegate at the World Bank has estimated that over the next few years, we are likely to see the damage done by flooding alone increase from today's roughly $90 billion a year to as much as $1 trillion a year by 2050. And so that's the sort of, when we're talking about an intensification and an amplification of natural disasters linked to climate change, that's the sort of magnitude that we might be talking about. And there are lots of reasons for this. There are more people living in vulnerable areas, in floodplains, arid zones, and so on. There's around the world aging infrastructure that is not able to divert, defend, protect, as it was when it was built, maybe in the decades after World War II, and of course, global warming and sea level rise are the climate change contribution to natural disaster. And the end result is more floods, more cyclones, more heat waves, more fires, more droughts, and so on and so forth. Now, over the past few years, and I want to suggest that this could be, that I can make a similar argument in relationship to water insecurity or agricultural outputs, but over the past several years, a body of research has grown up around the relationship between natural disasters and armed conflict. Kellett and Sparks in 2012 argued or estimated that about one half of the people in the world who are affected by natural disaster are living in conflict-affected areas. In 2013, the Overseas Development Institute released a report that argued that there are probably very, very close links between natural disasters and armed conflict. Natural disasters can deepen grievances against governments. They can increase opportunities for criminal behavior. They can provide opportunities for military and political gains that would have been very difficult in the absence of the sort of chaos that comes with natural disasters. They can create the impression that now is an ideal time to strike to secure certain types of goals. On the other side of the equation, armed conflict can increase vulnerability to natural disasters as it displaces people into more fragile environments. It can undermine the government's capacity to respond. It can inhibit aid from reaching an area. So insofar as there is some sort of important connection between natural disasters and armed conflict, then it's important that peace building be attentive to climate change. I think that we could make a similar argument focused on food security or water security or infectious disease. But I want to go further. I want to say that even in the absence of a strong connection, even if we decided that in a given situation, climate change related variables were not sort of linked to conflict, it's hard to imagine how we could go into a country and build capacity that did not focus some of its attention on managing the potential stress that might come from climate change in the years ahead. Just last month in Science magazine, a group of scientists declared or produced a very strong case about the Anthropocene and how we have now clearly entered a new era in which climate change is a key driving force. So I don't think that we would suggest to any country that building capacity today to break free of the conflict cycle and to move on to a pathway of sustainable peace can be done without some attention being paid to managing the risks and the potential impacts associated with climate change, especially since peace building operations are increasingly very long-term initiatives. Kosovo has lasted since 1999. I think Liberia since 2003, Cote d'Ivoire and Haiti since 2004, and so on and so forth. So I think there's a strong case to be made to integrate climate change into peace building. What exactly does that mean? In my experience, conflict almost always puts an end to collecting data about weather. It destroys weather stations. It moves expertise out of the country. So the country has a clear gap in expertise, data, and understanding. And this is the sort of capacity that needs to be rebuilt so that immediately a country is in a position to assess its vulnerability to climate change. And once it's made that assessment, it then becomes able to start to screen projects to see if they make sense from a climate change perspective, to contribute to whatever national plan for reconstruction takes shape in those first years, to contribute to longer-term national development strategies, to orient the country in relationship to things like the Paris Agreement and Sustainable Development Goals, and so on, so forth, and to think about how it's going to manage risk in the value chains that are important to that country. Whether they're agricultural value chains, like how do you manage risk in something like coffee, or whether they are energy-based value chains or what have you, transportation ones. Being able to think about how you'll manage the potential climate risk is increasingly important. I think that in the peace building phase there may be some trade-offs. There's no doubt about that. We know that cheap energy is often very important when it comes to getting an economy going and creating employment, and you know, the pressure to do things like that is enormous in a peace building situation. But I think at least if we build the capacity to start to understand with greater clarity what these trade-offs are, then we are making the sorts of investments that make sense in a peace building country. It's important, I think, that we acknowledge that this expertise has often been damaged or destroyed during the period of conflict, and it needs to be rebuilt quickly, so that all of the decisions that are made can be filtered through some lens of climate awareness. And I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
Well, that was great, and I'd like to thank both of our speakers so far for being so concise. That's fantastic. That I think also gave us a really good initial sense of how we can link then the conflict, or I should say, climate change as a conflict driver with peace building policy and practice. So I think that was fantastic. Let's now move on to Simon for his intervention. Simon, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar from Waterloo, where the weather has been very erratic for the last few weeks. And one of the things that I think is crucial to emphasize in what both of the previous speakers have said is that climate change is, well, it's already here up to a point, but we can expect the more erratic and unpredictable circumstances of the present to become the norm in the future. And hence, we have to think about anticipating how we deal with less predictable circumstances, increased disasters, frequency of flooding events, and so on. And insofar as we are thinking about peace building at a variety of scales, thinking seriously about that word building in broader senses than what Richard has just talked about is actually quite important. Because what he mentioned was decaying infrastructure, particularly in North America and some other places. What we now need to do in terms of thinking about what is coming is thinking about how we build not just institutions, but that infrastructure in particular in ways that will allow it to adapt to more extreme and more variable circumstances, both socially and, of course, particularly in terms of weather systems and so on. We need bridges that will handle floods. We need software systems that can deal with interruptions of power when the grid gets damaged by storms or floods or some combination. We need to start thinking about quite literally building in adaptability and flexibility to what we make in future. We can think about building in terms of quite literally the structure that I'm sitting in here, reducing the amount of energy it needs, reducing the amount of throughput of materials, reduces the strain on the environment. Building in that sense will hopefully reduce the speed of climate change and allow us to adapt, assume that we will get less disruptions and hence presumably less danger of major conflict on various scales. So let's start with mitigation, as the climate change folks used to say, as being crucial too. We need to think about reducing the amount and speed of climate change so that our hopefully better designed and better built infrastructure can cope with whatever is coming. We need to think about this right through our economies, right through our societies, because as Anna made very clear, we have no clue how to function with a modern civilization in a planet that is 4 or 6 degrees Celsius hotter than what we have been used to for, let's face it, most of the last 10,000 years. So one of the things that we really need to stop and think about is the future, how we anticipate the unknown in the future, and we have to build into our thinking about how we shape the world of the future, building the flexibilities into it, designing buildings that can deal with extreme events, can deal with cutoffs if energy happens. Because one of the things that's absolutely clear about modern societies is that we need continuous supplies of electricity and other energy to keep our big cities running. When that starts to break down, the potential for political disruption grows. If the political elites fail to deal effectively with political disruption and subordinate groups don't step into the breach, then you have a major issue in terms of instabilities, grumpiness in general about the failures of political elites to provide what is needed, and the potential for all sorts of political disruptions. And indeed, that really is the Syria case that Anna mentioned. It wasn't climate caused, but nonetheless the completely inappropriate response by the regime to the influx of migrants from drought-stricken areas, treating the migrants as a threat rather than as citizens who should be looked after, was a crucial political mistake on the part of the Assad regime, and we all know how badly that has spiraled out of control subsequently. So thinking about the future, thinking about how we anticipate those migrations, how we anticipate people displaced by droughts and such things, what they will need and what state institutions are needed in advance is crucial to anticipating how to avoid conflict, rather than having conflict and then having to rebuild the societies afterwards. And so this is what is one of the crucial things that climate change requires us to think through. Look at the future, anticipate the fact that it's not going to be the same as the past. The technical term these days is the ugly phrase non-stationarity. Things are not stationary. We are living in an increasingly dynamic world. But we are living in an increasingly dynamic world where the traditional patterns of governance over the last 70 years are showing strain in many ways. They are showing strain in very simple ways because what much of the United Nations system has done over the last 70 years is establish the territorial fixity norm. We've fixed borders. We have decided that governance should be run effectively by administration over territorial states, by sovereign governments. Yes, they're involved in all sorts of international treaty obligations and all the rest of it, but basically the administration of most things happens by territorial states with fixed borders. But in a rapidly changing world where climate is changing in particular, environmental responses to such stimuli are usually for species to move. And we have built fences and we have got stationary fixed borders, solving some of the European war problems of the first part of the 20th century with a fix that worked fairly well, but is now actually presenting us with a series of governance challenges which requires us to think about how do we deal with mobile phenomena using fixed territorial jurisdictions. That at the heart of the global governance crisis that we need to stop and think about much more carefully. Because if we end up with more discussions of building walls to stop migration, if you've been following American politics, a certain Mr. Trump seems to think that this is the solution to many problems. Patently, obviously, in a climate change world, this is just going to make the vulnerabilities of people who need to move out of harm's way even worse. And we have got to stop and think about how we reconstruct global governance at the very biggest scale to deal with some of these difficulties. Thinking ahead, many of these things can be dealt with. Failure to think ahead, and then we may end up in all sorts of much more serious trouble than is necessary. The relationships, just to wrap up my thoughts, the relationships, however, between climate and peace are very complicated, and one should not assume that environmental progress and peace are necessarily related very simply. And this is, of course, a task for policymakers and researchers on the ground in different places. One of my friends many years ago said something very profound to me when I was complaining once again about the apparent inability of the world community to solve the Palestine-Israel conflict. And he looked at me and says, yeah, but Simon, you're one of these people that does this environment and security stuff. You know, one of the things that actually worries some of us who work on the region is if we can finally solve and let's hope we can, solve the Israel-Palestine issue and get some kind of a permanent settlement, one of the things that's going to happen is a huge influx of investment into the region, particularly along the Mediterranean coast. And frankly, the environment there is simply not going to be able to handle a whole lot more pollution, a whole lot more building, a whole lot more investment, much greater economic activity. So in fact, peace might be an environmental disaster unless we can, really dramatically change the kinds of development that might result. That gave me pause because stopping and thinking carefully about the interactions of these things and simply assuming that peace is necessarily good for environment in particular circumstances is something we need to be very careful of. The old saying is, if you wanted to be a whale in the 20th century, the best time was in the 1940s, because during the Second World War, of course, international whaling fleets basically went back to port because submarines had a habit of sinking them very rapidly. In fact, war then caused the recovery of the international whale, I nearly said whale fleets. The whales were able to breed without being harvested for a few years, and it caused a big difference. So one of the things that I want to leave you with is a cautionary tale about simple causal assumptions built into this discussion. It's much more complicated, and it requires us to look long and hard at detailed situations on the ground to think about the intelligent way to move forward. That said, what is clear is that rapidly reducing the amount of carbon fuels we use and hence slowing climate change will make all of the other things we need to do easier, because one of the really great difficulties that climate change is starting to point at is the speed with which things are starting to change, a speed with which most of our institutions aren't ready to deal with yet. So slowing down climate change, mitigation, as they say in the climate business, is certainly going to help with adaptation, and thinking intelligently about what we need to do to adapt to a changing world should certainly reduce the number of outbreaks of violence that might happen if we don't think carefully about how to adapt for that changing world. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Simon. Again, really appreciate that presentation outlining and giving a note of caution about the complexity of these interconnections between climate change and peace building. Well, now, as you can see, we have all four of us up on the screen now. So this provides an opportunity for our viewers to ask questions. And we already have a couple of questions that have come in. I'm going to put the first one up on the screen. And this is from Brenda Erskine. And she's asked, I'd like to know if there are current best practices in integrating climate adaptation with peace building over the long term. So have we seen climate change considerations or adaptation already being considered or integrated into peace building thinking and practice? And maybe I'll start here with Richard. Do you have any response to that question?
I mean, I think I would say that we're at a fairly early phase and the objective of peace building largely is to build the capacity so that to help prepare a country to deal with uncertainties, with things that are unexpected, with things that we're not entirely sure how they will play out in those circumstances. And I think that we're seeing a pattern of trying to build some expertise, trying to sort of get weather stations functioning, fill in data gaps, and help the country move into a position where it can start to assess its own climate vulnerability and start to say, okay, how are we going to make decisions going forward about restoring water, restoring energy, building our economy, and so on. We're not going to do it without any understanding at all of the potential implications, because we've seen in countries, in some of the earlier peace building countries, where these considerations were completely absent, that years later they were sort of facing the challenges of flooding and agricultural problems and energy problems and so on. So I think that we're starting to see experimentation with this, but I think it would be difficult to say that we're seeing best practices emerge that have had successful long-term impacts. I think that's that's something that we're still sort of experimenting with. And part of the problem is there has not been very much in the way of resources to assist countries on this particular front. So there's so many challenges getting getting young people back to work, getting police and militaries professionalized, making the area sort of safe for people, building reconciliation process. There's so many demands that and there's never enough capacity to meet those demands. So I would say that remarkably little so far has been invested into climate change adaptation mitigation, but there's some experiments in that regard.
Okay. Anna, I saw you nodding while Richard was speaking. Maybe I'll pass the floor to you.
Yes. Yeah, I'm not a specialist on peace building, but what we're hearing here at the GCSP with the people we interact with, and they very often come from war-torn societies or post-conflict areas, they ask us the same question, and we actually cannot answer it because, as Richard said, it's really in the experimental phase, basically. So for the moment, I have not seen really, and it's more a question and a plea to to all of you who are in the field and who can feed a little bit this knowledge to us who train people, then who then create policies further. And another thing is what Simon said about peace building and actually seeing further and seeing, like, anticipating. Like, we as a humanity, as institutions, we are not really good at it, and it's been seen in the conflict prevention that it's been brought up in all the discussions, but we really don't do it much, right? And we're not really excelling at peace at prevention. And as I said in my presentation, like, climate change is really a big prevention action globally to make peace building and other issues, other security challenges easier.
Mm-hmm. Simon, did you want to also contribute to this? Oh, sorry, you'll have to say again.
Sorry, no, I'm just saying that I think my two colleagues have covered that topic very well. We are at the early stages and much more thinking needs to be done.
Okay, fantastic. Well, the next question, I'll stay with you, Simon, because the next question is directed directly at you. I'll put it on the screen now. It's from Kelly Rico, and she asks, you mentioned that the political elites need to respond to infrastructure challenges. I work in a Canadian global infrastructure investment entity. What could the economic elites, i.e. investors, contribute to environment mitigation strategies? What thinking needs to change regarding global investing to mutually protect citizens and large-scale infrastructure investments?
There's a simple answer to that question and a very complicated answer to that question. Kelly, the simple answer is do not invest in coal-powered electricity generation plants. Because quite clearly one of the major issues we are dealing with in coming couple of decades is going to be how we get off using coal to generate electricity, because while people need electricity, coal is a particularly nasty substance, both in the immediate health impacts of what goes up the smokestacks, but also, of course, the carbon dioxide that goes up the smokestacks. So thinking about making sure we don't invest in things that lock us in to long-term carbon use is absolutely crucial. Beyond that, it gets much more complicated because clearly what one is trying to do is build things that are adaptable and flexible for increasingly unclear future circumstances. We do need to stop and think carefully about the climate risk for anything that one is investing in. Richard mentioned looking along the value chains to actually figure out, well, where are the climate risks and where are the conflict risks? We live in a global economy with huge amounts of stuff moving right across the planet. And thinking about the vulnerabilities of your potential investments to climate and conflict, to disruptions, is simply a matter of sort of working risk analysis into all investment decisions. And if they are vulnerable in terms of communication links going down, I mean, if you're going to put a factory in a particular place, then you've got to make sure that perhaps you've got 2 or 3 different bridges to get the stuff out of there, rather than being dependent on, you know, one, which big storm comes along, takes it out, and the economic consequences are very large. I mean, a lot of this stuff is beginning to percolate, if you'll allow the phrase, through following on from things like the Fukushima disaster a few years ago, where there was suddenly a massive panic internationally when somebody realized and put it on the news that the factory that produced high quality videotape that was being used by television stations for recording programs or whatever was out of action because of that particular disaster. It, you know, accelerated the final transfer to digital storage quite rapidly. That disaster did. Some of the big car companies found themselves with their supply chains messed up badly by the floods in Thailand 3 or 4 years ago, and they've begun to think about making these things much less vulnerable to single points of disruption. But the converse of the case is, how do you build infrastructure that isn't dependent on single lines of communication, that is flexible, so that if one link goes, you can bypass it and move in other directions. Thinking through how we design our investments so that they're much more flexible and they can deal with more extreme circumstances seems to be the crucial thing we need to think about. And that, of course, is difficult to generalize about, because you have to look at each particular project, each particular investment, assess those risks, see how redundancy is built into it so that the risk is actually mitigated before you put the money in. That's how we need to think about this, because the world is changing, and anticipating how your investment is going to deal with the changed world now has to be part of how we think ahead.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Okay, I have a question now, and actually I had 2 questions that I'm hoping to pose to all of the panelists. The first question, I think all of the panelists mentioned Syria as a recent example where a climate change driven problem with drought in Syria led to migration, which was a conflict driver. I was wondering if any of you could provide other examples recently where we've seen examples of conflict where a climate change driven event helped to spur that conflict. So we could have a little bit more context of where we're seeing this in other places. I know, Richard, you've done a lot of work in different conflict affected states in Africa and beyond. So I'd be very curious to hear if you've seen this elsewhere. My second question is really looking to the future, is a bit more broad. I know all of you said that we're in early stages still in looking at this relationship between climate change and peace building. But if you could design or if you could make recommendations on how the international community, international governance mechanisms and structures could move forward, what would those be? And maybe even more specifically, if we look at interventions in fragile and conflict affected states, look like at a place like Afghanistan, a country that has suffered from droughts periodically that have had devastating effects, that have spurred tension, spurred conflict. How would a conflict, or I should say a climate change sensitive peace building approach in a place like that look? Are we talking about really just deploying expertise, people who understand this problem, and to be able to look at challenges in Afghanistan and other conflict affected places through a peace building lens? Or are we talking more broadly? Is it necessary to talk about making big investments? So Simon talked about investments of infrastructure here in North America. Should we be talking more seriously about investing heavily in these types of infrastructures, even in conflict affected states, as a preventative mechanism, but also as a stabilizing mechanism? So I know that's a bit of a broad question, but I was hoping you could first of all, going back, giving some examples of other places in the world where we see this problem starting to emerge for different reasons linked to climate change. And secondly, just some initial thoughts on what a climate change sensitive peace building process would look like. So maybe I'll start with Richard, and then I'll go around the table, so to speak.
So in terms of the first question, I think that we're seeing, everybody has been cautious in saying climate change is the cause of things, but there's no doubt that we're seeing flooding and drought implicated in conflict dynamics, whether it's in Sudan, that was one of the early cases that people talked about. More recently, we can point to places like the Philippines and so on, where you have rebel activity on the ground. It ebbs and flows, but it was clearly affected by things like the massive cyclones in 2012 and 2013. The same I think would hold true in India and in areas like Nepal. It's hard to understand the conflict without looking at water scarcity, water issues, the agricultural pressures, these sorts of things, which are in a variety of ways amplified by climate pressure. So I think that wherever we're seeing all over the world, droughts, cyclones, floods, and they do affect conflict dynamics in important ways. Do they extend conflict? Do they amplify conflict? We're trying to understand this. But I think that everybody has seen that there's a close relationship between the two, and we don't have to go, very far back in time to identify more and more cases. In terms of the second issue, let me just follow up on what Simon was talking about, because in areas like Canada and the United States, they're facing much of the infrastructure is sort of well into the second half of its useful life, and there's going to be a need to deal with infrastructure. The U.S., for example, the American Society of Civil Engineers has rated U.S. infrastructure overall as a D+, very close to failure. So there's going to be a lot of activity, and stimulated by things like Hurricane Sandy, to think carefully about the next generation of infrastructure. At the same time, we are seeing a very clear pattern in peace-building countries of private-public partnerships, some of them involving Canadian companies very prominently, Liberia, for example, which are engaged to work with the government to rebuild energy infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, and water infrastructure. And I think it's very important that if we're going to allow the expertise from countries that are dealing with their own infrastructure challenges to be brought to bear in peace building situations and to be critical to rebuilding infrastructure there, then we have to try to find policy ways to ensure that state-of-the-art sensitivity to climate stress and to a world that's going to face unknown pressures is part of the package. I think what we're seeing in places like Liberia is shoddy infrastructure being rebuilt that is not likely to be able to withstand much in the way of climate stress in the years ahead. So I think that we want to look at things like private-public partnerships, which are increasingly critical to peace-building situations, where governments are bringing in expertise and technical skills and financial resources from other economies, and depending on them to help get their energy sector rebuilt, their water sector rebuilt, their transportation sector rebuilt. I think we need to think more carefully about some of the long-term implications of these investments, because right now it looks like they're a little bit, they tend to be maybe exploitative a little bit.
Anna, I'll give the floor to you.
Yeah, okay. So I'll just come back to what I said during the presentation. I don't really think that there are other examples of conflicts that were maybe driven at a certain point by climate aspects. You might think of Tunisia and food crisis there, and but really there is my argument is really about how the governments deal with these tensions. And you have a lot of other populations that move from rural areas to the cities, but their presidents or the governments don't end up, killing off a lot of the population. So it's not really, it's more about the governance and the leadership than really climate change as such. It's how you deal with this with these challenges. And for the second question, actually, you know, working for the GCSP and seeing all the people that come here and really look to how to deal with all these challenges, I'd say that the best strategy is really education, and education of both policymakers, but also the increasing of the technical capacity of people who will actually be able to work on these infrastructures that Richard was just mentioning, right? It's not about, it's really about building the internal capacity of these war-torn societies. So I would stop here, and if you have any follow-up questions.
Okay. Simon.
Two very interesting questions there, Mark. I just try and draw Anna's response together in a slightly different way. She mentioned Tunisia and the food crisis there. Now, the international food situation was at least partly a contributing factor to that. The conventional argument is, well, it's all the Russians' fault because the drought the summer of 2010 in Russia, you may remember the scenes of those huge fires and all the rest of it. They got a heck of a hot summer and a very dry summer. As a result, the Russian decision makers, so the conventional story goes, were increasingly alarmed about the wheat harvest and hence how they were going to feed Russians in the winter of 2010-11. And they closed off the export. They forbade exports of wheat from Russia, which caused a spike in international food prices, which worked its way through the Tunisian markets, and indeed the trigger of food prices was that set off the Arab Spring. So the conventional story goes, is in fact caused by the Russian international grain shipment embargo decision. Yeah, there's bits of that are part of the story, okay, and I don't want to make the argument that that's not the case. But what's crucial here is that we look at domestic consequences of international decisions. What I think we really do need to do is think about how we handle the international grain trade rather better. We are currently heading into a serious drought in southern Africa, which has made very little press coverage. And clearly we're going to need the international community is going to have to deal with that. In many cases, we simply haven't anticipated these kinds of issues, which are going to recur increasingly frequently. And so the international political economy of the grain trade is related to the particular cases like the Tunisian one that Anna highlighted. And I think, in terms of answer to your second question, this is part of the of what we have to think about for international institutions and peace building, in the sense of being able to deal with some of the obvious dangers that come from famines and so on, requires a better anticipation of where food is going to be scarce, and it requires a better coordinating mechanism on the international food system than we currently have, because then global policy implications can ease the tensions in particular places and hence reduce the potential for conflict showing up in particular places. Let me just say a couple of things. You mentioned Afghanistan, and neither of the other speakers responded to it. Afghanistan has taught us many lessons, or at least it should have. It is worth pointing out that it is one of the countries that doesn't have good meteorological statistics, because, of course, the Taliban demolished much of the meteorological monitoring system when they came to power. I'm not quite sure what ideological grounds they justified that decision on, but nonetheless, it is worth noting that it's one of sort of the missing parts of on-the-ground data. Somalia doesn't do much better for, well, similar reasons. The war there causing all sorts of problems. But the response in Afghanistan, I mean, one of the things that went terribly wrong, particularly in rural Afghanistan after the invasion of 2001, when Canadians and Americans and NATO, all sorts of strange military organizations ended up in the south end of Afghanistan, including, unfortunately, a whole series of drug eradication programs. Now, one of the cash crops across rural Afghanistan was opium, and it was the best investment for a lot of farmers trying to recover after the war. The response being, oh, well, we've got to eradicate opium without providing alternative crops that would yield anything like as much. It would have been much cheaper and much, much better for rural Afghanistan to simply buy up the opium crop, offer good, firm, reliable prices. It would have been a few $billion here and a few $1 billion there, a fraction of the cost of many of the efforts we've made, and it would actually have provided a commercial basis for recovery in large parts of the Afghan countryside after the war. We could actually have used that as a feedstock for various pharmaceuticals internationally. We might simply have wanted to have ditched it all in the middle of the Indian Ocean, but it would still have been a much better policy option because, and this is the crucial point, it was sensitive to the local political economies in rural areas, how people were getting their economic life back on track, and how it is that you can rebuild rural economies in the aftermath of conflict. How you can do that with drought-sensitive crops or crops that you can plant after floods. That's the kind of peace building we need to think about. But it has to be sensitive to what's actually happening on the ground economically in particular places, even if it offends our sensibilities about narcotics. Nonetheless, being sensitive to what's happening on the ground is a crucial part of post-conflict reconstruction.
Absolutely, that was a very controversial issue on the ground at the time in Afghanistan over the years, specifically when some of these ideas of licensing crop and production was introduced. And I think you're absolutely right. The need for some creative and context-specific solutions. One other thing that occurs to me is that one of the things that I think comes out in the discussion is also the need for early warning and preventative mechanisms. So in essence, when we talk about peace building, in some ways we're talking about, to a certain degree, fighting the fire once the flames are already there. But really a lot of what we're talking about to be effective is to identify when there are, for instance, drought that could create food shortages or forced migration that could trigger conflict, good early warning mechanisms. And in that sense, also prevention. Is there any discussion from a global governance level, but on such preventative mechanisms, such early warning mechanisms? I know you've all said that we're still in an experimentation phase, but even in the research that's out there, which you're all familiar with, is this something that's being actively discussed? So maybe I'll start with Anna here, just to mix it up a little bit.
Let's say, an innovative approach. It starts all with the data gathering, and there are a lot of initiatives that's around the world that are actually going into this, both on the geographical and the observation of the environment itself, but also on the human movement. And there is this new initiative by the IOM and other organizations. I think it's funded by the European Union, that will look actually at the nexus between climate change and migration. And they've already organized a lot of meetings, and I think they're producing now an atlas of climate migration, of environmentally induced migration. So you can look into this initiative. Then there are also private companies that are starting to develop some applications that deal with this, that talk about these issues. I know that there is a think tank in Germany, in Berlin, ADFI, and I know they are cooperating with some private company that actually produced an application. I don't have it in my head now. If you want to, I can check it and send you an email with the precise name. But I know that there are a lot of initiatives, and actually people are getting more and more creative about it. And what's really an optimistic sign is the private sector is trying to it's also getting engaged in these initiatives. So that's it from me.
Fantastic.
Hmm.
Richard, I'll pass the floor to you.
Well, three things come to mind. One is that in terms of the peace building apparatus itself, that part of the United Nations, it doesn't really have a mandate to become involved prior to a conflict. It isn't sort of set up for that purpose. That doesn't mean it's not interested. But it tends to be activated later in the process. That said, I think there's lots of thinking about the importance of conflict prevention today. In the United States, for example, it's becoming increasingly clear to many people, both within and outside the military, that winning these wars is extremely difficult and maybe in many cases more or less impossible. So the idea that you can get involved, win, and create a new social contract and walk away happy is sort of slowly dissolving. And so people are looking at how do we use power more effectively, and maybe it is in areas of prevention rather than in trying to win wars. I think that one thing that is very promising is that several years ago there was lots of confusion about what we could do with big data sets and so on. I think that now we're discovering a tremendously sort of exciting set of modeling activities around the world where they're bringing together big data in very sophisticated ways using numeric problem solving equations to really refine our ability to potentially provide early warning systems. So in the past, a lot of these were very crude. They just sort of toted up half a dozen variables and so on. But now people are starting to say, well, if we want to predict where flooding or drought is going to occur, we can now bring everything we know about precipitation and about wind and about temperature and about topography together, and we can start to really reduce the level of uncertainty that we had 4 or 5 years ago. So I think that in some ways we're on the verge of a new generation of early warning systems, which will be more useful than the systems that we had 5 or 10 years ago. So that could be potentially exciting. It relies on having data, and if you're as Simon pointed out, a lot of these areas have fairly significant gaps, and we've discovered that filling those in using smoothing techniques actually does not really help in terms of developing fine-grained models. So you need the on-the-ground sensing capability to build these things. But once you have that, we may well find that over the next few years we can develop some early warning systems that are much more useful to people, much more customized to their particular needs and situations, much more sensitive to local changes and local sort of responses, much more focused on human environmental sort of interaction than the systems of a few years ago. So I think we have some grounds for optimism in that regard.
Okay. Simon.
Then becomes, can we use those more sophisticated early warning systems to actually generate the necessary political attention to the particular issue in a timely fashion? And I think that one of the things that over the last decade or two we have not done well as a global community is respond to clear indications that things were going wrong. There's an awful lot of policy is made up on the fly. It's reactive after a crisis starts rather than trying to head off things. The mess with the Ebola crisis, the reaction was way too slow, and that one got out of hand in West Africa in a way that was completely avoidable if careful warnings had been heeded, and if we had better global infrastructure, institutional infrastructure ready to move. Yes, the health folks are now trying to figure out what went wrong, and they're reacting much more obviously and robustly to the Zika virus scare. But quite how that is going to play out, I don't know. But will 5 years down the road we have learned the lessons and get permanent funding reliably in place for international institutions so that the early warnings can actually be acted on when they are still useful, i.e. early. And I think that the global governance questions that we collectively face are a matter of building international institutions. How we do that in terms of finding firm funding bases, given the way the world has gone in terms of not funding these things well, particularly since the 2008 financial mess. We do have some long, hard thinking about how you mobilize constituencies to do that much larger institutional building, which we really do need to get on with, because the bottom line on climate change is the world is changing rapidly. We are going to have to deal with these. We can choose to deal with them well or badly. The consequences are going to shape the future quite profoundly.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. I have a few questions here. I'm going to put the first one up on screen is something that's very specific from a Dr. Noakolo, I should say, who said, with Lake Chad losing 90% of its size, it has resulted in the migration of the Fulani and the Hausa farmers down south, leading to various violent clashes between the communities. How do you deal with such issues, considering the political and social science dimension? So essentially, here's a local level example in Chad of how, in this case, the loss of a water source due to presumably climate change also being a factor, leading to migration that has triggered some tensions and conflict. Now, how do you deal with such issues? I guess the bigger question here is, how should the international community respond? Now, I think in our last, in the last round of remarks, we heard about how, Simon discussed how we often see these things coming and we still don't act because there's no political will. But I guess this gets to the fundamental is how, maybe even in an ideal world, but what type of response should come? And I know, Richard, you talked about the need for coordination among various different actors, but what type of response should come when we see these types of tensions happening or these types of conflicts emerging right in front of our eyes? Maybe I'll start with you, Richard.
It strikes me that this is a very specific example, but it's a very, very sort of common problem. It might be one of the greatest challenges of this time. I think Simon's exactly right that the 20th century was largely about the idea that things like peace and development were closely associated with making sure people had a high level of autonomy in a fairly clearly demarcated territory. And if we're in a world in which increasingly certain areas of the planet are not going to be inhabitable, they're either going to be constantly flooded, battered by storms, subjected to long-term droughts, and so on, then we've got a challenge for the entire system. As Syria points out, it is not easy when you have something like 14 million displaced people, and many of them are going across the borders. It's not easy for the world to figure out what to do. So whether they're internally displaced or displaced across borders, we do not have a system which easily manages that particular type of stress. And in a way, managing that type of stress raises questions about the very sort of political ordering of the world that we have. So I think that this is a huge challenge for us going forward. How do we deal with the fact that there will be tens of millions, maybe more people displaced by flood and drought year after year after year, and in many cases they cannot return to where they came from? What are we going to do with this huge number of people? I don't think we have the mechanisms in place, and I think that the sort of scrambling to deal with the situation in Syria is showing us that how quickly this can mobilize very, very strong political resistance. and that's, you know, and that's, I think, alarming to everybody how easily it gets mobilized into a security issue and an issue which where people say we don't want to have to deal with this problem.
I'm going to move straight to the next question because we have a number of questions are coming in now, and the other Simon and Anna, you'll be able to sort of touch back on this last question if you want in subsequent answers. But I think this next question relates to that and relates very strongly to everything we're talking about. It comes from actually a colleague of mine, Jonathan Sandy, who's worked with the African Union. He's worked with the United Nations and the government of Sierra Leone, where he's from. And he asked, what role for the security, what is there a role for the security sector, security forces in addressing the emerging complex and multiple challenges associated with climate change and environment security threats? And when he says that, it just makes me think about also going back to the Ebola epidemic and how security forces in various African countries, particularly in West Africa, played an important role in addressing this, had a mixed record, obviously. And of course, these security forces will have an important role in confronting climate-related challenges and security threats in the future. So maybe I'll start with Anna here. I'll go around the horn again. What role for the security sector do you see in this going forward?
It's really like, as Simon said, it's a little bit of the reactive role, because the security sector cannot really be the actor of, or is not, at least for the time being, an actor of mitigation of climate change. It's more in the adaptation part, and so this is particularly in the dealing with the aftermath of natural crisis. This is really the natural disasters. This is really the role that the security sector has a huge one. Both the natural disasters and for example health disasters, as you said, in Ebola, in the case of Ebola. Then another thing, and it was really interesting during a climate change and security course we organized here, when we had a view from the military point of view on what the security sector could do in this issue. It's basically going green and really using different sources of energy and really pushing the governments to invest more in green energy. I know it sounds very simple, but it's actually something that we have to think about, and the military could think about, and could be actually a huge driver of the move towards green energy. For the moment, this is yeah.
I think that's very interesting, in fact. No, the military is obviously one of the largest institutions in many countries, so if it could serve as an important example, that's fascinating. I think being somebody who works on the security sector and deals a lot with talking about reforming and training security forces, I guess part of what I'm getting at is, should we, specifically also in conflict-affected countries, seek to sensitize partner countries and their security sectors more to these types of challenges, to prepare them to deal specifically with whether it's health epidemics, environmental challenges, and so on? That's, I guess, part of what my thinking is. Simon, do you want to jump in on this?
To add to what Anna's saying, I mean, the argument used to be made that if you can get particularly the American military to go solar, it'll buy so many solar panels that, it'll drive the price of solar panels down. And they've got all these wonderful, great big hangars and things on their airfield that'll be perfect to put solar panels on. And I think that actually, may have helped a bit, because the American military is starting to think about this. Going back to the Afghanistan thing, of course, the people who are not too keen on that kind of military intervention are horrified when you point out that if you take solar panels into the forward operating bases and you recharge all your electronic kit with solar power, rather than hauling huge amounts of diesel into the generators on those bases, that in fact you've made the military far more flexible and far more effective. And that tends to bother people who don't think that the kind of American military intervention in Afghanistan that happened a decade ago was good policy. This plays in all sorts of different interesting ways. I think that one of the other things that we do need to bear in mind that the military, at least in the next decade or so, may be very useful for, is building on what Richard said about early warning. Nick maybe in a number of cases has made the argument that, you know, what institution in modern societies has the responsibility for thinking about long-term existential threats? And the answer is the security sector. But it doesn't necessarily follow that beyond immediate disaster response, for which the military usually has the logistical capabilities that other agencies don't, but beyond the initial response, they're not actually a good fit for dealing with a lot of issues. They can raise the alarm, but when it comes to converting our economies to solar and wind power and getting off coal, for instance, you know, the military doesn't have a heck of a lot of role apart from a policy advocacy argument where it can say, if you want to stop further chaos and confusion and expensive military operations, get off coal, decarbonize, and that'll make adaptation and easier and reduce potential conflicts for which we are ill-equipped to deal. So disaster response, yes, although it would, of course, be nice to have an international disaster response agency that wasn't the military, ready with specialized equipment to deal with disasters, but we're not there yet. It would really help because the military is not usually trained and equipped, but you can adapt their training and equipment to deal with it and improvise on the ground. But the long-term early warning thing, that's one of the things that the security sector needs to pay more attention to.
Richard, do you want to come in and make a comment here?
Very quickly, I think I agree with Simon very much that lots of attention focuses on the link between climate change and violent conflict. But the military's other role has historically been to think about the grand strategy of security. What do we need to be fully secure? And I think that not as much emphasis is being placed on that today as was the case, say, in the 50s and 60s when we were thinking about a world war and nuclear weapons. We need to be thinking about the grand strategy of a world that is safe, where the biggest threats may come from areas like climate change. I agree that the military has so at least big ones have a unique position to procure, to affect the economies through their procurement policies, and they have an opportunity to develop, climate sensitive technologies that may be more difficult in other sectors, and we should encourage this. And I think it's also the case that they are in the front lines of response. So they're in a sense, they are the witnesses of what climate change can do to places, and they're important witnesses because they actually experience many dimensions of flooding and drought that the rest of the world hears very abstractly. Either you're affected by it or it is an abstraction, and these are one of our bridges into those areas. So we should, we should listen to some of the things that they're telling us about these areas.
Okay. Right, fantastic. I'm going to go to our next question, which I'm going to put on the screen. And in fact, the final two questions I think are very strongly related. This question from one of my colleagues here at the CSG is there a challenge of making climate change interventions locally owned? And I think speaking specifically about fragile, failed, conflict-affected developing states. And he says, in a general sense, is there significant demand for climate change mitigation programming in these contexts? Does it tend to be a donor or aid recipient priority? So is there demand, in other words, for these types of support intervention at the local level, and Simon earlier, I know, was talking about Afghanistan and that there was demand for different types of responses than what the international community was selling on opium. But is the issue of climate change, is this something that's really being driven by international donors, although of course with insufficient resources, as I think we've said, or is this something also that is coming from recipient or partner countries as well? So maybe I'll start again with Richard, and we'll go around.
Two things. I would say that there's probably a relationship between having had the experience of living through flood or drought or these sorts of things, famine, and wanting to manage that type of risk. So people who have had that very direct experience probably do have a bias towards developing the capacity to manage that risk in the future. They're very much aware of it. I'm not saying that the donors aren't promoting this, but I think that we're getting a lot of information and a lot of demand at a very local level. People who are in the front lines of drought, of famine, of infectious disease, of flood, who know what it feels like and are trying to develop the tools to reduce their vulnerability. What are those things? I think that, again, it is early days, but we know that there are many strategies over which local communities can have control. So whether it's green infrastructure to manage certain types of flooding or drought, to local policies about water use and so on, there are some areas in which local communities cannot own the response because the challenges are overwhelming. But there are other ways in which we can certainly help develop the capacities that give them a fair amount of control over managing the risks that they experience most directly. So I think we need to continually listen to these communities and sort of improve our understanding of the challenges they face, the priorities they have, the tools that they feel they need to manage risk as effectively as possible.
Mm-hmm. Simon, I'll go to you now.
That links a number of these topics together, following on from Richard's comments, of course, is that local communities often find themselves post-conflict, post-disaster, fairly seriously disrupted. But what's playing out in some places is also that sort of the larger global political economy is having very direct, immediate effects in particular places. There's been quite a bit of discussion over the last 5 years, or well, perhaps a little longer than that now, about the phenomena that's known as land grabbing, where big international corporations or states are actually purchasing substantial tracts of land in places in the global South Africa in particular, because, well, they're actually concerned about their food supplies being disrupted by climate change. Therefore, making sure that you've got chunks of land in different parts of the planet to provide food. If one gets disrupted, you could substitute somewhere else. Means that those kind of food security strategies are actually changing the rural political economies, and in many cases dispossessing small-scale farmers, local communities, indigenous peoples in particular. There was a really interesting case a few years ago in Ethiopia where a large purchase of land by folks from India came as a bit of a surprise to the locals in Ethiopia who didn't know that they didn't own the land they'd lived on for many generations. So those kinds of disruptions are also part of the rapidly changing rural political economy, within which local peoples find themselves vulnerable, find themselves perhaps dispossessed, if the local circumstances don't allow them to easily access other land, which they may not be able to purchase given the disruptions of land prices involved in the global land markets. Those are the kind of really tricky issues that, again, thinking about how it is that local states respond to disasters and conflict is mixed up with the the influx of capital to purchase large chunks of land. How that plays out is, again, it's an empirical question in particular states. And anybody thinking about how it is that you deal with post-conflict recovery or whatever needs to be sensitive to how those issues are playing out in the particular context on the ground. It's very difficult to generalize about them, but they are one of the things that makes marginal populations particularly vulnerable, particularly if development that comes in after a conflict, emphasizes the major commercial sector because you're looking at the national economy rather than the vulnerability of marginal peoples. Those are the kind of policy issues that we need to bear in mind are sort of overlaid on this question of post-conflict reconstruction.
Okay, Anna, you're going to have the last word for the whole event. So from our speakers, so go ahead. No pressure.
No pressure at all. It's almost weekend here, so. So just to this question, and I can't really speak to what's happening in the field because we bring people from the field to Geneva, to Switzerland. And what we've been having is really a huge demand on the part of people coming from war-torn societies to come here and participate in courses in executive training on precisely dealing with crisis management, dealing with the challenges to security, dealing with the conflict cycle, and all of these issues. So there is, I think that there is a big interest and demand of the local populations to really learn and learn how to deal with these challenges themselves, and not having this imposed by external donors, by international community. I was just thinking about this question about the Chad Lake, and it's really interesting because of course there will be big movements of people, and it's starting. We don't have data yet, but yes, it will happen eventually. But what's interesting is that, you know, the first thought we had, it was like, what would the international community do? But actually, what would the countries that are around the lake do? And how will it be dealt with on the multilateral level, on the bilateral level? This is really interesting. So instead of thinking of, you know, what the global community could do, we actually could also empower people who are there and who know actually how to develop the cooperation mechanisms so that they can deal with it without the intervention of the outside actors. And there is an excellent study on how precisely water cooperation is a driver of peace, or rather that war is less possible between countries that have an institutionalized water cooperation. It was done by the Strategic Foresight Group in India. So voila, I will leave you with this. Thank you so much for your attention.
That's great. Well, we've run out of time now. Let me apologize to Jessica Wang. There was one question left, but which I think dealt with the same topic we just talked about, which is how to bring these challenges and to look at them at the local level. But I think this was a fantastic event. I'm not going to try to summarize everything because it was such a free-flowing discussion. We covered so much ground. I will say that we will be producing a report from this event, which we will hope to publish in the coming month, which will lay out what we saw as some of the most interesting insights that came out of this enriching discussion, and perhaps even some conclusions. Also, just so everyone's aware, the video from this event will be available on our website going forward. It will be posted there in the next few days, so feel free to share this as much as you can. Our previous event videos are always widely distributed, so I would encourage you to distribute those among your networks as well. I'll also draw the attention of those of our viewers to fill out our poll. You can see the link at the top of your screen to let us know what you thought of the event and anything that we can do to make it better. So let me thank our speakers once again. I think they did a fantastic job. I hope everyone's clapping at home. I know it's hard to really feel the love of the crowd, but you're very much appreciated, and thank you for taking the time. Anna, specifically, thank you for taking the time on a Friday evening in Europe, so I appreciate that. And I hope you'll all keep in touch, and perhaps we can do a follow-up event sometime next year. Well, thank you very much. I'll bring it to a close now, and please do fill out the poll. All right, bye-bye.